Mike. Mike worked for us part-time. He does a lot of electrical stuff.
Minister in charge of special projects.
Yes, yes. He tries to come down to our level. He's an electrical engineer, so, you know.
Doesn't always work.
It doesn't always work. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and good luck there.
All right, thank you.
It's a wild crowd.
As long as you have the width in the chair.
I'm ready.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Good, okay. I'm sorry, I have a cold as well. I'm on my second cold in as many months. So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about some of the things we see here, especially that I see, having to do with electrical systems. We'll go over some troubleshooting do's and don'ts and some modification do's and don'ts. I have seen some, for want of a kinder word, interesting modifications done to some of these cars, and it amazes me every time I see one that they aren't bursting into flames every time the owner turns the keys, because frankly, even the third string anemic handicapped electrons that come out of a British car electrical system will set the car on fire if given the right conditions. So anyway, let's get started. One of the things I see a lot of, and I have no idea why people do this, is the harness is actually cut open. They've sliced into the sheathing that covers the harness and just kind of flayed the whole thing out just to kind of see what's in there. And then the other fun one is somebody will decide, oh, let's paint the underside of the dashboard, and they paint it, and now I have a big collection of wires that are all one color. And you tell me where to start. So yeah, don't do that. There's no need. If you have to cut into the harness, there's a problem with the harness. If something's not working, it's not the harness. Usually, it's what's at either end. Lucas is great for not sealing switches. I mean, you can take switches apart. I've taken switches apart and cleaned them and put them back together, and they work perfectly. But because the switches aren't sealed, the weather gets in there, they get a little bit of corrosion on them, and then they just stop working. And you can, check things like door switches with an ohmmeter, and yeah, they are actually switching, but the closed state has such resistance that the light won't come on. It's like, okay, well, then that's the explanation for that problem. So that's one thing. One of the other things we see a lot of are overheated connections. This came out of an MG about 3 weeks ago. This actually is the output, one of the output wires on the alternator. And this is the bit that plugs right into the back of the alternator.
Hey, that brings up a good point. And I shouldn't interrupt, but I'm going to constantly do it because it's my shop.
You're allowed to. It's your sandbox.
That's my sandbox. He brings up a great point. And a lot of times what I was talking about before about, keeping everything correct in your car, or correct as possible, is that, sometimes we get a car in here, like this MGB, and somebody tries to put the positive to the negative, and the negative to the positive. Yeah. The car does not like that.
The car doesn't like that at all.
What sets this whole thing in motion is they put a red cable on the negative side. Not to mention, so that starts the whole ball rolling.
Yeah, that starts.
And then what they do is they can't get, and I'm just talking in general terms. I'm not talking about anybody in this room. So then what they do is, because the big post is always positive, the small post is always negative. So what they do is they can't get the positive post, so they either crush it to get it on the negative, or they expand to the point where it almost cracks to get it on the positive. So a real quick tip is your battery cable, your ends, your terminal ends should go right on the post. There shouldn't be any kind of monkeying around with it. So, but if they don't, there's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yep.
I'm trying to.
Okay.
You're doing a great job.
Great, thank you. Well, we've all got started. I've got plenty of time to screw this up. Okay. Yeah, this came off of an MGB about 3 weeks ago. And what was happening here is you get a little bit of corrosion on this connection, just a little bit, just a film, and it causes it to get a little bit warm. Well, when it warms up, then it gets a little more corrosion on it, which makes it get warmer and warmer and warmer. Well, ultimately, when I pulled this off, the connector, there was just a web holding it together. It actually broke in two because there was nothing really holding it. And as you can see, the wire is melted back almost 3/4 of that length. That's just the heat from that connection that was causing that problem. Now the customer was ready to, he bit the bullet and bought a complete wire harness from the dashboard forward. We saved him a small fortune because that basically was all that was wrong with his electrical system. And we repaired that wire and taped it back up with the exception that the tape looked new compared to the other stuff, he was very happy, and it worked just fine. But you can make repairs, but you got to watch out for stuff like this, because you need to get back to a point where the sheathing is still intact. One of the other things, yep.
Put on the connections to prevent corrosion.
I will talk about that. One of the other things we also see is, I guess this is the reason the customer cut this open, is this wire is melted. I've seen wire harnesses, the whole length of the harness, one wire is just peeking out all the way down the length of the harness. A lot of times that's a ground fault. As two things cause that, and they're working together. Conspiracy, sounds like to me, is a fusing problem and a grounding problem. There was an issue about 2 years ago with fuses that were rated at a certain current rating to fail, yet didn't. And I saw a little movie of a test somebody was running where the wire is actually starting to turn black. And the fuse could care less. And they're watching an ammeter go up to 40 or 50 amps on a wire that size. That's not going to last very long. So that's the failure mode. So either the wrong fuse is in there, or the fuse that doesn't have a correct rating. It's not what the engineer called out. And you've got a ground problem. So you've got a hot lead that's just basically turning red at that point, and it burns its way out of the harness. You can sort of repair that if you want to, but I would strongly recommend you replace the harness. And the harness for any British car pretty much is in 2 or 3 sections, so you only have to actually replace the piece that's bad.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you talking about somebody putting in a 20 amp fuse that calls for 15?
Yes.
Or are you talking about a 15 amp fuse that's not?
That's not 15 amps. It's more like 50.
Okay. But
Yeah,
it's
we've
marked
seen that.
15.
Yeah, it's marked 15, but it's more like 50 or better. You wouldn't. That's the problem. But I think they, sort of discovered that, but it didn't seem to be specific to Lucas fuses or the clear hooter fuses, because even some bus fuses were doing that. Bullet connectors. These little things here. These are all over a wire harness. And I've run into issues when they get old, they break. This is basically just a piece of spring metal, and after a while they corrode, they get kind of brittle, and they just kind of snap. And you've got all these little pieces hiding in this rubber sleeve, and you don't really know it's not working. But you turn your lights on, and one set's real dim, and another set's real bright, and then you realize, well, maybe I got a ground problem, and you pull the connector apart, and all the pieces fall out. Don't bother reusing these. If you've got an electrical problem, you're trying to trace something, you got a dirty connection, throw these away. Put in a new one. They aren't worth saving. The bullet end can be polished up with a little bit of Scotch-Brite, but frankly, doing anything with this is more trouble than it's worth. And this is my favorite. I don't know how many times I've looked under a dashboard and found a wire that had burned out and it was all taped up, just like that. At best, this is temporary, and at the very least, you should find out why this happened, because it'll happen again. Again, this could go back to a fusing problem or something. We had a Healy in here a while back. I saw a lot of this under the dashboard. I suspect it was because it was converted from positive earth to negative earth, because when we made the conversion, again, we were putting a radio in it. I missed a connection on the wire and actually saw a little bit of smoke coming out of the dashboard. Don't say that too loud. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. And then I'm digging around trying to figure out what it was, and then I realized, yeah, okay, when you turn the switch to on, the white wire goes hot, and that's going straight to ground, and that's why it was doing that. So at least I understood why it was happening, and that was easy to undo that mistake. But again, there's a car, in my opinion, as part of the work here, it should have gotten a new wire harness, because it was in tatters. So those are the big things. Those are the problems we see with troubleshooting and some of the things to look out for. Now, some things that are always a good idea. Number one, invest in a multimeter. These things are great. These are my eyes and ears. I use these all the time. This is a Fluke 77. They don't make the 77 anymore, and a fluke meter goes, they start at about $300. You don't have to spend that kind of money. Sears to the rescue. That's like $50. It'll tell you all the same information. And you basically only need, for an automobile, DC current and voltage and resistance. Anything beyond that is just, extraneous information, just makes it more useful for other things.
It's good to have one with an audible beep, though.
Yeah, a continuity tester makes it really nice because I can be poking around up in the dashboard and all I have to do is listen for the beep. Then I know, yeah, okay, that one's good. And you move on to the next one. Matt went crazy. This is about a $600 meter. This lives in a case.
I'm listening.
Yeah, yes it does. Yeah, this is an automotive meter. It does a lot more than what you would need. But a simple 4-banger meter, man, that'll get you through 99% of what you need. Same thing can be said for a test lamp. These things are good too. Maybe they don't give you as much information. The meter is really good for specific information. We've run into situations where, yeah, I touch it, the light lit, but it didn't work. But when I went on the meter, it's like, okay, it's 6 volts, not 12. There's the problem. It's supposed to be 12. Well, you've got something else going on. The test light won't tell you that, but it will at least tell you that something's there. Schematics. These things are great. I've looked more of these things than I care. The ones we offer through British Wiring are all color-coded. They're very easy to read. But it's like a roadmap. They don't tell all the story. They just give you a general idea. I was dealing with a Spitfire yesterday. First off, it took me about 20 minutes to figure out which car I was working on because you're never 100% certain. And there are running changes through productions which aren't always reflected on these pieces of paper. So the schematic will give you an idea what you're looking for, and it will show you generally how things are supposed to be, but don't absolutely guarantee that that's what's in the car. Just because, somewhere along the line there, when this was issued, well, they may have had 20 or 30 harnesses they were trying to get rid of first. Yes, sir?
Where do you get that?
You can talk to our man Josh, but these kinds of things are in the back of any service manual. And it's more a matter of being able to read them. Now, the great thing about British cars, and I guess this is the thing, that, when you're on your own island, you can do whatever you want. Lucas being the manufacturer of British car wire harnesses, they use a common color code, and it's common throughout. So, for example, a brown wire is a hot feed off the battery, always, always, always. It may not be connected directly to the battery, but at some point it finds its way back to the battery. A white wire is a switched hot off the battery, that's like usually ignition. Green is a fused, switched off the ignition. Blue is lighting. Red is lighting. Blue is headlamps, and red is side markers and parking lights and instrumentation. So, just a couple of, just a short list of color codes, you almost know immediately what circuit you're working on. You almost don't need a schematic as long as you know what color the wire is, and that's common from the MG all the way to that Aston. That Aston was the same way.
Can you go through those colors?
Sure. A brown is hot feed off the battery.
Right.
Blue is supply to headlights. So if I come off the back of the headlight switch, I'm going to have a red wire that goes out to my parking lights and to my instrumentation cluster, but it usually goes to the instrumentation cluster through the rheostat. So it'll be red to the rheostat and then red with a white tracer off of that does all the little light bulbs. Blue is off of the switch that goes to the high-low beam, and then from there I break off, it's blue and red and blue and white.
And black.
Well, black, yeah, ground. And then
Typically, your schematic gives you that,
they'll give you the color codes, yes. They'll give you what
they're for.
they'll put a letter designation and then tell you, they'll give you a legend of what that means. And then white is switched hot feed, so that goes through the ignition switch. So I'll have a brown coming up the ignition switch, and then off of that will be a white wire that goes out the ignition circuit, goes out to the start circuit, and to the fuse box, which then jumps and becomes green, and that's a fused switched ignition. So that's for your radio and turn signals, all that other stuff.
Where people can become confused with that is a lot of times the wires are striped color.
Yes, right,
It's not a solid color,
Right.
it's a striped color.
right. Yes,
To put an auxiliary plug in for a phone charger or a GPS,
uh-huh,
should they run an inline fuse off the battery
I would.
and not cut into the
Um,
wire behind it?
if I was gonna do it, I would find a spare terminal on the fuse box, for example. And you can get a piggyback male-female spade that'll slip on, so you could kind of, add a circuit without overloading your connections.
You know, I think sometimes if a lot of people will try to go for a green underneath the dash.
Yeah.
Because green is hot. And I think but green's already doing a bunch of green
Yeah.
stuff. So you start plugging into this, and then it
Yeah.
doesn't,
It's more inconvenient when you turn everything on.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the wire harness on the TR3 and they take one tiny little wire and it's here, and it does everything. It's like, oh my God, what keeps this thing from just going woof, and the whole car just goes up like a
Can you talk about gauges of wire? Because you replaced with the wrong gauge.
Yeah, I'll talk about a little bit of that in a couple minutes. One of the biggest things when you're troubleshooting, and I do a lot of service work over the phone. People are trying to work on the stuff that I build, and I'm dealing with lots of different skill levels, is I try to force the guy on the other end of the phone to be methodical. Don't jump around. Start at one spot, work your way down the line, because it's just one long straight path from here to there. Supply, delivery method, load, ground. I mean, and the problem is in one of those four. If something's not working, it's a switch issue, you've got a bad connection, you've got a bad ground, that sort of thing. If you're methodical, you'll find the problem.
you know, and you could take that, I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
but I just happened to do that. The other aspect is that certainly on some of our British cars, you can just unplug stuff. So you can, as far as being methodical, as Mike was saying, you can, I know what happens here once in a while where we're trying to get something accomplished and we can't find the specific area. So what we'll do is we'll end up just unplugging stuff
Yeah.
and trying to trace it out that way, and then you kind of get to the end. I mean, sometimes it's hard to find the problem, but if you start to unplug stuff and figure out what's going on, then you can.
Right. Yeah, when a car rolls in here, sometimes you have to approach it as a fresh sheet of paper. We don't know anything about the history of the car. We don't know what's been done to it. You kind of start from scratch and get a feel for what's been done. And again, being methodical that's a very good way to get through the problem quickly and get to the point where you get things working. Yes?
One thing on fuses, British spec fuses versus American fuses.
Right.
They're not the same.
Correct.
So,
What they list on there, for example, 35 amp fuse is, and I'm not the fuse expert here, but what's listed there is not the continuous rating. So like a 35 amp fuse is actually 17 amp continuous. 50 is something else. Again, I'm not the expert on fuses, but yeah, you can't just go out and say, oh, it's 35 amp. It's like a 35 amp fuse in there. You will have a problem. Intermittent issues. These things can drive you crazy. My taillights worked yesterday and they don't work today, but I go over and whack the lens, they come back on again. This is why. It's this stupid little thing right here. And what they do is when they made it, they've got a beryllium copper ring, which is the tail that touches the side of the socket, and then they've got this spring finger bit that just fits on top of it, and they just sandwich the two together and then roll this nylon over it and just solder or plastic weld the whole mess together. So there's no true interface, it's just two pieces of metal touching each other. Well, after a while, you get a little layer of corrosion in there, and the headlight, it works or doesn't work, but as you drive the car, the parts are kind of rubbing against each other. Eventually, they start to come back on. The easy fix here is you go to Home Depot, you buy a $9 soldering iron, you scratch this little connection in here where the two sort of come apart from each other, just scratch it, solder that joint together, and it will work forever. And it's just stupid junk like that makes us chase issues all day long.
Mike, what were you holding up?
Tail lamp socket. like a turn signal socket for a TR6. That's probably where that came from. Now you had asked, somebody had asked, how do you prevent corrosion issues in connections right here? Tube of dielectric grease made by Permatex. Buy it in any auto parts store. It's kind of a silicon-based grease, kind of white in color. It's very slimy. But you squirt a little bit of that into one of these, and then push the bullet in. That connection will be good forever. So this is the best way. Whenever I'm now doing work on my cars, this is always handy. Because I don't want to have to do it again.
I call it copper shell. They work with vets. And it's the same thing, but it's copper embedded high temperature grease.
Okay.
And I do it with each light bulb socket.
Yep.
I do it with everything I ever work on. If I take it apart, that goes on it. Even battery
Yeah,
connections.
right. This is good because it keeps the water out. But if you know, the British, for a country where it does nothing but rain, they make no effort to keep the water out of things. You look at a new car and the connector, and there's an O-ring in there, and there's grease, and you put that together, and nothing's going to get in there. And that connection will work forever, but our cars just, they weren't designed like that. It's called dielectric grease, made by Permatex. Napa sells it. I've seen it in pretty much anywhere, maybe in various size tubes. Okay, and then finally, I mean, face it, sometimes when it gets down to this, it's time to just replace it and be done with it. If you're just chasing problems one after another and everything you do just keeps getting worse, time to clean the slate and start over. Put that in the trash, get a new one, start over. I mean, you stop and think about it. The factory built these cars. They were small cars, cheap cars built to a price. They were never really intended to last as long as they last. That they have lasted this long says a lot about how they've been cared for. But after a while, even a wire harness has to be considered a consumable item. And every car is probably going to end up getting a new one eventually. Okay, so that's some troubleshooting stuff. Modifications. I see these all the time. Sometimes they scare me. Other times, people who do this should be taken outside and beaten to death with their own inventions because they're just bad.
But he's not talking about customers.
It's a good thing I don't get to meet them sometimes because I would have a few things to say about them. One of the things I see a lot of is I needed to do something. I had a couple of scraps of wire laying around. I taped them together and I got a piece of wire now. Here you go. My son deals with people who do this all day long. They don't understand what's wrong with that. And a funny thing was, I put this together as show and tell, and I pulled it out this morning, and I stretched it, and it popped. It came right apart. That's how good it is. I mean, all you've done is twist a couple of pieces of wire together. You didn't do anything to try to make sure they stayed together. You're just relying on friction to hold them together. It's a perfect place for corrosion to get in. You pull on it enough, it will come apart like that. This is garbage. So don't do this. This is bad. Don't do this. The other one that kills me is splices. I worked on a car where this was done quite a bit. I thought, well, somebody's taken a lot of care, but they still ended up with junk. They took a razor blade, they scored around this wire, and stripped off a little section about that big, and then wrapped the splice around it, and then just taped it up. That was the splice. Okay, well, it's pretty strong, I'll give it that, but you still have the same problems as you did with the other junk. You really didn't seal it, you didn't make a good mechanical and electrical connection, you just wrapped a wire around there and kind of tapped off.
How about solder it?
Right. Solder it. Better yet,
And it's not even the same color.
one of these. Yeah, one of these. This is an insulation displacement connector. Basically, it's a barrel connector with another barrel parallel to it, but that one doesn't go all the way through. And you clip the barrel onto the feeder and slide the tap into the other hole and squeeze the whole mess together. And there's a barb in there which actually forces the insulation apart and squeezes the wire into it. That will stay together forever.
Hey, Mike, I'm sorry, make sure you tell everybody that they're banned.
They're banned here?
Yeah, I don't trust those.
No.
I've used some, and there's another type too called Scotch lock, which actually
Low
clips.
current is fine. High current,
Yeah, you gotta be careful.
Also corrosion.
Well, you still have, but they do seal a little bit better. They're certainly better than this. But yeah, if you want it done right, yeah, solder it, absolutely solder it.
Would you put dielectric grease on that too before you close it up?
I don't know what, no, you really shouldn't have to because the barb actually pushes the insulation apart. So you've sort of got a seal between the insulation and the barb. So in some respects, it's kind of weather tight, but
some come with it inside already. The
yeah,
dielectric
they're making improvements to these. But again, it's kind of a modification. You do want to keep some of those things to a minimum. One of the things I've seen, and there's not a good way around it, is I want to add, auxiliary driving lights or something, and they'll just run a feed wire out along the main harness. At least you've done that much. But you've got a single conductor outside of everything else, just kind of rattling along with the car as it goes down the road. And to me, that's just, you're asking for trouble because you're going to eventually abrade through that harness somewhere, and that lousy little wire is eventually going to find a ground, and then you might have an issue with that. If you've ever noticed that one of the things that I like to see when you've got a single conductor is put a piece of sleeve over it. Then that way at least you have 2 layers of insulation which prevent that problem. Ball of wire. How many times I've taken a panel off and it's just stuffed. I mean, it just crammed full of wire. And you pull it out and it's just a rat's nest of wire. I don't even know where to start with that mess. Get what's broken fixed, stuff it back in, hope it doesn't short, get the car on its way. Because if you turn me loose on it, I would spend days on it, and that's not what the customer's looking for. But you can't tell him he doesn't know what he's doing because he doesn't want to hear that either. But yeah, I mean, unlike horsepower, more wire is not better. It's just asking for more trouble. Black tape. One of the most overused tools in the inventory, I'm sure. They use it for everything. Use it sparingly. Seriously, the glue gets creepy when it gets hot. It gets kind of slippery, so it really doesn't act like tape anymore. And when it gets cold, it gets brittle, and the glue gets hard, and it just comes apart. So this is really only, I use it a little bit when you're running up you're making up a harness. You get to the end of the sheathing, just one little turn just to kind of seal it all off.
Question.
Yeah.
Sir, after something like that, a situation where you solder 2 wires together, they also sell those cans of the dip, the blue dip,
Yep.
plastic dip, that solidifies.
Mhm.
If you have the option, if you can use it, is that,
Liquid tape.
Liquid tape,
is
yeah.
that better than?
I've never used it, but
Better than that, right.
yeah, I mean, anything that insulates the connection, that's really what you're looking
That's
for.
better than the tape, which solidifies
Yeah.
around it.
Right.
Form it. Okay.
Right, but I've never used it, so I can't speak
Seal
from
the ends
experience.
of connections to prevent
Oh.
leakage.
Mhm.
Mike,
Yes,
there's lots of grades of electrical tape.
yeah,
The Harbor Freight tape, not so good. If you go in to buy the, I think it's 3M
yeah,
or Scotch at Home Depot or one of the other stores, it's quite expensive for a roll,
right.
but it's superior tape.
Well, that's what this is actually. This is Scotch 3M, but still, I mean, I see so much of it used all over the place that to me it's an overused tool.
I miss the old cloth friction tape. You just can't find it anymore.
Yeah.
That was, to me, one of the best.
Right, but you still have the same problem. The glue eventually dries out.
Yeah.
Question,
Yes,
What about the use of that heat shrink tubing?
that is my first choice, always.
Mike, how do you feel about all the various solderless crimp-on ends?
I've used a few of them, but a lot of times what I have, I bought an assortment of barrel connectors. They're actually just the metal element that's in that, and crimped it and soldered it. So with a kind of belts and braces sort of approach. Yes?
What kind of sheathing is on the replacement harnesses that are available now?
Uh,
There's different choices, right?
yeah, you can either get cloth or you can get tape.
No, you just said don't use tape.
Well, no. The tape that they're using is a vinyl tape, but it has no glue.
Right.
So you just, it's a wrap, it's just a wrap. And actually, I think if you look at one of the harnesses you could buy here, I think when they get to the end of the wrap, they even use a little piece of shrink tube on it. So you just put that on, heat it, and then that's never coming off.
Is there any reason to choose one over the other?
Authenticity. Authenticity.
It's the model of the car.
Correct, yes. The earlier cars had a cloth insulation, cloth jacket. The later cars went to the tape one. Okay, all right. Some of the modifications I've come across. This is lamp cord. I've seen this under a dashboard. Okay. Now, all right, it's a piece of wire, I'll give you that, but the last time I checked, my living room didn't do 60 miles an hour. The problem here is that the insulation on this is made for an environment that's relatively constant. I mean, the temperature change in your house is probably only about plus or minus 30 degrees. Humidity is relatively constant, and the lamp just sits on the table. Now, I'm sure my Mini will tell you that it got down to 0 a couple times this winter. And I park it buttoned up, sitting in the parking lot, and I'm sure it could get over 120 during the daytime in the summer. The insulation on this wire is not made for those kind of temperature extremes, and it will fail eventually. And that's why you don't use this. I've also seen this. This belongs in my house. Solid single conductor 18 gauge or 12 gauge house wire. Problem here is this stuff is really brittle. It doesn't want to bend. So if you bend it a couple times, it'll work and it'll fail. So at the very least, it's the wrong type of wire. I've also seen phone cord. The 4-conductor, single strand phone cord. 22 gauge. 22, yeah, or 20, or they make another one, I think, too, that's a little bit stiffer. All these things just make me laugh. And then I just want to hurt the person that did that.
Upgrade to the Cat 5 wire on that if you really want to do
I wouldn't, yeah, wire's wire, right? What's the problem? And finally, wire nuts. Now, I can't specifically cite anything that's wrong with using a wire nut. It makes a good mechanical connection. But I have to borrow a line from the boat building or aircraft construction industry that if it looks right, it is right. And this just doesn't look right. I'm sorry. So, those are all the things I've seen that you want to try to avoid. So when it comes to some modifications, really you want to employ what in the industry would be called good practice. This is just a show and tell item. I tossed this together yesterday. This was a language course. This would be total gibberish. This isn't anything whatsoever. But it was just done just to kind of show how it's done. It's got the proper terminations on it for bullet connectors and for spade connectors. Single strand that would run out by itself was in a sleeve. Got a good fitting grommet if I had to go through a bulkhead. It's all wrapped with the non-sticky tape. And at the end of the termination, a single turn with black tape just to seal it all up, because with the non-stick tape, when you got to the end of the run and you stopped, if you let it go, eventually it would kind of creep backwards and start to unwrap itself. So you got to have something that finishes the job. You could do it this way or use heat shrink. And the idea, when you're done and you put this modification in, it should look like it was born in the car, like it was designed in and built and put in at the factory. If you've done that, you can make all the modifications you want because they're hidden effectively in my mind. Let's see, one more don't.
Mike,
Yes.
thanks to this place, we can now buy bullet connectors.
Yes.
We never could.
That's right.
However, I learned here
You need the tool.
a couple years ago why I can't use them at home.
Okay,
Now tell us how to put a bullet on a wire.
you need the tool.
Well,
Or solder, they can be soldered.
but not with an iron. Here they use sometimes a torch.
to get really hot to melt the solder into the bullet.
Right, right.
The bullet isn't enough.
The bullet isn't enough. The crimp works. But yeah, I've seen, if you look real close on factory harness, they are soldered as well. Problem with soldering though is it does, if you're not really careful, it leaves a blob of solder on the outside and then the thing doesn't want to fit into the sleeve.
Well, there's two different bullet connectors, one that is made to be crimped and one that's supposed to be soldered. You
Right.
can't use one with the other.
Right. Most of the ones that we offer here that I know of are crimpable. They fit
Well,
in the
they sell
gun.
both.
They're all in
I
different
bought both
sizes.
here.
Yeah. You're making a modification to your car, and you always want to make sure that you leave yourself enough wire. Obviously, somebody didn't leave themselves enough wire, and they got this tiny little stub right here with a connection in it. If I have to cut off and throw away 3 feet of wire, I'll do that rather than be 3 inches short, because to me, I've just wasted my time. Always use a grommet when you go through a bulkhead, because if you don't, that harness will just sit there and rub against that sharp edge, and eventually all your good work is going to go to naught. And finally, again, if 3 feet of wire is enough, use 3 feet. Don't use 5. Any other questions? Yes, you're first.
I'm gonna be putting in a new wiring harness soon.
Okay.
What tools would I need to do that, or is it just plug and
It's kind of plug and play. Schematics a big help.
No, but I mean as
What?
far as the ends, they're all ready to go. You
Yeah,
put
they-
them
yeah.
in. You don't have to buy the tool at that
Correct.
point because you're not fixing it.
Correct. The only thing you might run into is anything that remains behind in the car that's not part of the harness you're replacing. For example, like I know on an MG, when you come through the bulkhead, come past the heater, you've got a couple pairs that hit some connectors. One set goes out to the reverse light switch, and the other set goes down to the starter motor, or the starter, or something to do with the starter. Those pieces I don't think are included. So if you pull the connector apart and one of the bullets come off, then you're gonna have a problem. But again, that's something you can approach when you get there. Hold on one sec. When you take the old harness out, don't chop it up. Remove it whole. Lay it out on the floor. It'd be a big help. Use it as a road map, just kind of get an idea. Okay, I remember this came off of there. Tag a few things if you have to, because that's always a big help. Yes, sir.
Battery disconnect switch,
Yep.
plus side or minus side?
Plus side or minus side?
We try to put it on the negative side.
There you go.
Okay.
Yes.
The bullets, when they go into that four-way spade or whatever you
Right.
call it, sometimes you can't push them in.
Right.
I understand now they have a tool
Yep.
that pops them together.
Mhm.
Before I found out about that tool, I took a pliers and I modified it.
Oh, okay.
Snick it over both ends.
I used to use a small screwdriver, just get behind the bullet and give it a good shove. But if the screwdriver slips, you're going to put the
Yeah,
screwdriver
yeah.
to your hand.
Going back to the tool arc, I used a pair of channel locks and I still use a pair of channel locks. I've done it forever, and it works very good for, we do sell a tool. British Wiring has a tool that'll actually help put the bullets,
Right.
the bullets in the sleeves, and it can be a pain in the butt. There was a problem a few years ago, well, probably 5 years or so ago, that the actual bullets were just a hair too big, and you try to put them into the sleeve.
It wouldn't work.
It was a pain in the you-know-what. So, but what that did, that translates into taking something apart. Now you can't get the bullet out of the
That won't pull out.
sleeve. So then you're pulling the bullets,
Yeah.
because the crimp is only going to crimp it so hard. So now you've got a bullet inside the sleeve, and now you're kind of, but that's been resolved. But I brought out some of my tools that I keep in my toolbox, just very
Yeah.
generic.
Now, these do 3 different sizes of the spade connectors, both male and female. This is the tool for the bullet connector. You'll notice, if you look at the bullet connector, they have different size holes in them, but the body of the bullet, the outer diameter is always the same, so it all fits in the same tool.
Yeah, I got that tool. Here.
Yeah. I bought a set for myself for Christmas.
I
And
took a regular pair of pliers and I took a small filed a little groove in it
Mhm.
so it fit over top of it on both sides and pushed it together.
Yep. And then there's a pair of wire strippers. Sears. Yes.
You mentioned the battery cutoff switch on the negative side. Is that for positive ground cars or negative ground cars? Or either doesn't matter?
It really doesn't matter. You're just trying to isolate the battery.
Is that a good idea to do? I mean, you got those extra connections.
All you're doing is taking the terminal off, putting this switch thing in between and putting the terminal back on. So you're really not undoing anything, you're just adding a switch in between.
That's okay. I have it too.
Yeah, no, I don't have an
What's the
issue.
purpose of it?
It just to isolate the battery. If you put in a new, well, in an emergency, you certainly have that.
Stupid door off of there
Yeah,
first.
right, well, in an emergency, you've got that, but new radios today, for example, have a constant feed that maintains the battery's memory, or the radio's memory for the presets. But that's a constant 10 milliamp draw all the time. Well, eventually, you know, give it 2 or 3 months of the car just sitting there, you're gonna have a flat battery.
You can buy an inexpensive battery tender and hook it
Yeah.
up also.
Right, well, unless you're like me, who parks my car in my shed, and the electrical service is 100 feet away. Yes?
About the bullet stuck in the sleeve.
Yeah.
Replace the sleeve or?
No, you can, I've done that where I was working on something, pulled it apart, and a wretched bullet stayed in the sleeve. I just took a thin screwdriver, plucked it up inside, and went bang, and the bullet just popped right out.
Ah, thank you.
Yep.
You know, the other thing you can do real quick is if you take the rubber, the actual rubber piece of the sleeve off, you'll notice that the metal part of the sleeve has a slot in it.
Yeah, it does have a slot in it.
So you can actually, you could just pull the rubber off, take a little screwdriver, expand
can
that
actually
sleeve
pry it
ever so
apart slightly to get inside.
and then it'll pull right out.
Mike,
Yes.
about the battery disconnect switch, if you put the battery disconnect on the side of the battery that's to the ground, then if something connected to the car does happen to fall onto the positive terminal of the battery,
Oh, okay.
it won't short out.
Okay.
Whereas if it's disconnected on the positive side, if you still touch the positive terminal,
It's still-
you could
that's still
short.
hot.
So the battery's
You're
effectively
limited,
dead.
Especially on a positive earth, you're limited because the posts are different size.
Right.
And that disconnect is a certain size.
Right. Yes?
What I did about, I don't know, 35 years ago, I put a switch in the glove compartments,
Uh-huh.
in the back of the glove compartments. It's a toggle switch, locks the glove compartment.
Okay.
And I wired the ignition wire through that switch. And when I'm in an area where I want to shut the thing up, I just pull
Okay,
the switch.
yeah, right.
To me, it'll drive someone
A
nuts
master cutoff.
trying to find that cutoff.
Yeah, I know. I've run into that where I was trying to get a car started and I couldn't figure out why it wouldn't start. And when I finally broke the car apart, oh, look at this. That's what that switch is doing. Yes?
Just a theoretical thing, going back to the dielectric piece.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always been a little bit confused about that because the grease itself is not a conductor.
Correct. It's not a conductor.
But you're putting it like, I've used it on sockets for screw-in bulbs and things
It's-
like that. So I guess to me, it would seem that it would interfere with the connection, but it never seems to.
Really, what's happening,
Is it
your
just
connection is still
displacing?
electrical
Here we go.
connection. It just keeps moisture out and keeps it
Yeah.
from corroding. That's all it really
Yeah, but if
does.
it's in between,
And
Well,
it makes it easier.
Yeah, but as you're putting it together, it's scraping it apart. It says,
Yeah.
protects electrical connections, ignition parts, and wiring from moisture, salt, dirt, and corrosion.
Also makes the bolts
That's
easier.
exactly what you want.
I know what it does, it's just I always felt that, you put
Yeah,
conduit to it,
right.
you're adding a layer
Well,
of
to me,
something.
dielectric is actually an insulator.
When you put your bullet nose together or a spade, it wipes that off.
I didn't have
It's designed to do
any
that, and it protects the rest of it.
So I used
Yeah.
the white lithium grease.
Yes.
Every time I really replaced the bulb or opened the connection up, it's still there, and it's actually white lithium.
And it works the
It's
same
gotten
way.
hard
It,
over the years, but it's still
yeah,
perfected.
and it works the same way. It just displaces the water.
You know, I think something about the dielectric grease is different than the lithium grease is that doesn't necessarily migrate like the lithium grease could. So depending on the temperature, wherever you're using it, lithium has a tendency to creep where that wouldn't creep, so to say. I mean, it accomplishes the same thing, it doesn't really matter, but
I only use the dielectric now, but the lithium was there from way back in '73. It's gotten actually sort of dry,
in there, even though it still protects, so when I take it out, I have to clean that off. I also keep that dielectric in the house when I put a light bulb in or
Yeah,
something. in the
yeah,
house.
because
I've
worked on high bay lights, and
Yeah.
when you got that big bulb in your hand and you're 20 feet off the deck and you're trying to unscrew that thing, and you hear it squeaking, you know it's trying to bother you. Yes, in the back.
But getting back to the battery tenders, on the Alternator batteries, do you have to have a special tender for that one?
I don't.
Some people say you should, some people say.
I couldn't tell you.
I haven't had an issue with that. You know, I was under the impression the same thing you gotta be careful, blah, blah, blah. I just put them on the charger. You know, it's a different style battery, but the bottom line is.
They're a marine gel battery, but they work basically on the same principle, so I wouldn't see why there'd be a difference. Yes, sir?
Like, do you use the dielectric grease in the battery post as well?
No.
Who uses that?
What was the question?
I do.
Yeah, I suppose you could, but I haven't done it. Using dielectric grease on a battery post, I guess you could, just to keep the corrosion down, but I try to keep the battery clean so you don't have that, you know, that acid working its way across the top of the battery. Yes?
Well, going back to the battery tender, I just bought one this past year from Eastwood, and it has a switch on it for an optimum battery.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what it does, but there's a
Makes you feel good. Well, we're not taking it apart to Yes.
Back to the grease, dielectric versus regular grease. I used to work for a company that made grease, one of the big grease making companies. Dielectric grease is not supposed to conduct electricity.
Right.
It's formulated not to
Right.
conduct electricity.
That's what a dielectric is.
Right. There's a
It's
lot of
actually an insulator.
additives in regular grease that is conductive.
Mm-hmm.
So it's theoretically possible that if you use regular grease on an electric connection, it could allow some electricity to leak through.
Kind of leak, yeah. Thank you. Anything else?
Yeah, it could allow electricity to leak out into something else we
Yeah.
don't want
Yes,
it
sir.
to.
I have about 18 ACR on my car.
Okay.
As far as the alternator goes.
You're asking me a real good question. Go ahead.
Is it true that I have 15 amps of draw extra that I want to add something like a fan or whatever?
Yes, as the number goes up, the output of the alternator is
I
improved.
think that puts out about 42. So I got a
Yeah,
little
yeah,
extra.
you're in about 50 amp range. So yeah, that's give you a little extra capacity. That's stag parked out there. That's mine, by the way. That's an 18 ACR alternator, and that car needs every ounce it can get because it has air and power windows and all that. And I'm just thinking to myself, you know, I don't know if that alternator is actually big enough considering all the loads. Because the new car is going to be 100 amps easily, which is why one of the popular upgrades is put the GM alternator
What
on.
on your regular TR6 without air conditioning, you got a little room there?
I put a 16 ACR or 17 ACR on my Mini, which is basically a radio, fan, and wipers. And I watch, when I'm sitting at a traffic light on a cold morning with the heater going, the wipers running, and the lights on, and that voltmeter is at 12 volts. It's like, you know, I improved it, and it's still not good enough. Yes?
Since we're talking about conversions, you know, upgrading the alternator, I've heard that you shouldn't go too high with the amperage.
Correct.
Because the wiring can't
Correct.
handle it.
Yeah, if you don't upgrade the wiring, if you fire up the car on a dead battery and the alternator is doing its mightiest to charge the battery, you'll melt the harness. Because you're going to be putting out the full output of that alternator in wire that was never intended for that.
So a lot of people are doing these conversions. How much of the wiring has to be replaced? Because obviously, I mean, you're not going to replace like the towelite wires. And
No,
stuff
no.
like that.
All you would have to really do is upgrade the wiring between the alternator and the battery.
You know, you can take, basically just take a brown wire from the
Yeah.
alternator right to the battery.
Right.
So if you're putting in, bottom line is that if you're gonna put one of those big honking 100 amp alternators in your car because you wanna run, I know Bill, you like your music really loud, and you know,
200 watts is good, 300
he's the
watts.
party animal.
Now, what about those stumpers?
Yeah. I can hear you coming over. But the bottom line is, we do some of those kind of crazy, I call them kind of crazy conversions, where we're putting a 100 amp alternator in the Triumph. And you know, the car's not going to be very happy with that unless you take some of that voltage off of the amperage,
Amperage.
amperage off the system, because the system can't handle it. So that's a great question. But if you take a brown wire, we try to use the correct wire depending on what we're doing. But if you use a brown wire, go from the alternator to the battery, that'll drain off some.
You'll give a better path back.
Yeah.
You'll be charging the battery directly
Sorry,
as
I didn't
opposed to
know.
through the harness.
Yeah, I guess the same thing for the upgrade of the headlights. Like,
Yes.
The current wire that's in there now, what's that rated for? Like I got the 18 ACR in there, what if I maxed out on that? Will the current wiring handle that, or should that be up?
No, I think your 18 ACR is okay.
Even if
You have two
maxed
wires
out?
on the, are there 3 wires on it or 2? Okay. If you have 2 wires, if it's a 3-wire plug and there are 3 wires in it, one wire, the small one is the sense wire, and the other 2 are the output of the alternator. And they're both heavy, so you shouldn't have an issue. If you have a 2-wire connection, you got a small one and a big one, I think they both go back to the battery. That you might be pretty close to the limit, but you still should be okay. Yes?
So what about relays for the headlight? You know, they all recommend.
Right.
Lost cell.
Right. Yeah, because when you really think about it, you're putting the British never believed in relays. You put the full draw through every switch, which is why the switches melt after a while, especially as you get old. But yeah, if you can do a relay upgrade, absolutely. Because I have an old Mini, which I use for every day, and I took out this single little, could barely hear it, sound like a baby belching horn, which also was kind of a little girly. I wanted a horn. I wanted people to hear me coming. And I put 2 horns in it, and I pushed a button, and they didn't make a sound. But the single horn worked. And I was like, okay, I can't put enough through this switch to make it happen. So now the horn button triggers a relay, which fires the horn, and now the horns sound, and they sound nice and loud. So yeah, when you go to a relay upgrade, yeah, what you're doing is you're taking battery power to run the load, not letting it go through the switch. The switch is just firing the relay. But that's always a good upgrade. Yes, in the back.
An alternator between the stock trunk alternator and the 100 amp?
Say again?
Alternator in between the 100 amp and the...
Yeah, I mean, General Motors makes all kinds of different outputs, but 100 amps is a big upgrade. I'm sure you can find something, between 50 and 100. Yes?
For the conversions that we sell here, what size is that?
That's a 65. That's 65. There you go. There's your answer.
That's just a regular Delco. It's a knockoff of a Delco 70s style single wire alternator. But at 65 amps, you're still able to maintain the original harness's integrity. So, unless you really stress it out, it's not, because it doesn't charge, it's not pushing 65 amps all the time.
Yeah, that's
So
only
you're-
momentary
you're-
you get that kind of surge.
Yeah, you have to really push things a lot, but, that, you can put that alternator on your car. We put them on TR4s, TR3s, and to no adverse effect.
Yes?
How do you feel about adding fuses to the British car?
You never have enough. I'll tell you a little story. I used to, when I first started working, my brother was as a mechanic, and he got involved with somebody who was doing gray market conversions. And we got a chance to see one of the first 928s come in before the dealers, or just about the time the dealers were getting them. And in the kick panel on the passenger side, he pulled the carpet down, and there was a wooden door with a little hole in it. He pulled that door up, and I call it the fuse room. I mean, there was a fuse box that long, and then there was a bank of relays underneath it, and just, it looked like a telephone interchange with all the wires that came into it. You can never have it. And I mean, every load, every light, every switch, everything had its own fuse.
2 fuses just doesn't seem like...
No, the early cars, the 2, 3s, and 4s, that scare me with that. And even the 3-fuse fuse box, to my mind, isn't enough.
Okay.
Yes?
Could you just explain what a relay is and what it does?
Your starter has one.
Yeah, your starter has one, but that's a really big honking one. Yeah, okay. What I have is, I'll try to give you a description. I have a bobbin of wire. It's a coil of wire. And inside of it is a metal plunger. And the plunger has a switch contact across it. So when I energize this coil of wire, it creates a magnetic field, which pulls the bobbin down hard, and that makes the contact connection. And then that's what delivers power to the load. Then when I turn the power off, the relay, the magnetic field collapses and the spring forces the contact open. Now the thing about a relay is that and the reason you use a relay is you can use 1 amp to control 1,000. All right, if I had a switch, if I actually had a horn button that was rated for the 15 amps that the horns required, I'd have a horn button that'd be that big and it'd be all contact inside. But the relay can be real small. I got a 15 amp relay that's the size of an ice cube.
So you got more going in than less going out.
No, it's the other way around. I'm using a small current. I'm using a little bit to control a really big one. Power companies do the same thing.
The small current is actually a switch.
Is the control,
It switches
yeah.
a small electromagnet. Electromagnet actually makes your contact
Yep.
with your higher load.
Is the relay local to the load then?
I could place it anywhere.
But ideally, it's close.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Or I could group similar functions and their operations together. Yes.
Talk about, since we're talking about relay, is there, how specific need they be? In other words, I mean, do they come, can you use pretty much one relay for anything you need a relay?
From what I can see, there are 2 different types of relays. There is one which is a normally open, normally closed. So I have a common and a normally open, normally closed. And then there is another type which is a normally open, but it has 2. So when it makes, I'm actually putting power out to 2 connections.
Double pole.
Yeah, thank you. Lost that for a moment. The thing you got to watch out for is that sometimes the sockets are similar. And if we got a car here, Land Rover or something, was doing all kinds of weird things, and I'm searching, and I pull the relay out. It's like, wait a minute. They're both 87A, which means they both go hot when the relay operates, and I needed a normally open, normally closed. I needed the other type, 56 and a 33 or something. So somebody had just, I need a relay, and they put the wrong one in, and then problems ensued. So they didn't read the label.
Way of knowing, what
You can read the label, and the label will give you actually a little schematic diagram. It'll show you, it'll label the connection numbers for the coil and the relay contact. Anything else?
Yeah, there's current rated relays, and there's also, we have to be careful, there's also relays for AC current.
Yes. Yeah, right.
Don't wanna try to
You
use
can't
the
you
wrong
can't
thing.
swap those 2 because the DC one will go blah, 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 blah.
And Watts has a good video of putting it in.
Yeah, right. And also, the wire colors I gave you a while back, that information is printed in the back of every Moss catalog, by the way. Okay.
All right.
I guess we're done. Hope you learned something.